So good evening and welcome to the first lecture in our IBC Bank and Commerce Bank Keynote Speaker Series for 2025 and 2026. My name is George Clark and I'm the Director for the Center for the Study of Western Hemispheric Trade in TAMIU's A.R. Sanchez School of Business. Our center, together with IBC Bank and Commerce Bank, brings speakers to talk about topics in the areas of international trade, economics, finance, demography, immigration, and democracy. Before introducing today's speaker, I'd like to thank our sponsors for supporting the event, IBC Bank and Commerce Bank. With their support, we've been able to bring many thought-provoking speakers over the years to TAMIU and to Laredo, so thank you to them. I would also like to recognize TAMIU's saxophone studio, guided by Dr. Claire Sally. Thank you for playing tonight and for setting such a welcoming mood. And finally, please help me welcome our new president, Dr. Christopher Maynard, to the series. Thank you for joining us today. Now, for a bit of housekeeping, at the end of Dr. Marczak's presentation, there'll be a question and answer session. We'll take questions from the audience in attendance here today. For those in attendance, please raise your hand and one of the students will bring you a microphone. It is important that you wait for the microphone because if you talk without it, people behind you can't hear you, and also the online audience won't be able to hear you. So if you can hold your question until you get the microphone in your hand, that would be great. If you prefer, you can also submit questions online via Slido using the QR code on the front of the program. For those attending virtually, you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature in Teams. We'll try to address as many questions as we can within the allotted time. For students attending in person and on behalf of one of your classes, you should have had your student ID scanned at the door. In addition, there's a QR code inside the program which will take you to an online form where you will submit your class information. Finally, you'll scan your ID when departing once the lecture has ended. For students attending online, your class information should have already been submitted during the registration process. So, today's speaker is Jason Marczak. He's the Vice President and Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin American Center. He has 25 years of experience in regional economics, politics, and development, working with high-level policymakers and private sector executives to shape public policy. Under his leadership, the Latin America Center delivers constructive, results-oriented solutions to advance hemispheric prosperity and is a regular venue for heads of state, cabinet officials, and other public and private sector lenders to build consensus on regional priorities and broader global linkages. He has a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nitz School of Advanced International Studies and a bachelor's degree from Tufts University. He's also a lifetime member of the Council of Foreign Relations. So let's welcome Jason Marczak back to TAMIU and Laredo.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Wonderful. Well, first of all, it's great to be back. Absolutely wonderful to be back here as part of IBC Bank and Commerce Bank's keynote series. And I want to start by thanking you, Dr. Clark, for the invitation, and Dr. Maynard. So wonderful that you could be here. Your inaugural IBC keynote series presentation. I feel like I have an important job to do, being your inaugural speaker. So hopefully I'll live up to the task. I also think it's great that IBC Bank and Commerce Bank continue to support this important series for the community. The front row here is my good friend Jerry Schwebel from IBC Bank, and Jerry, just thanks so much for all your friendship over the years. For me personally, it's been actually we were talking about this before the event, it's been about 3 years since I've been back here at TAMIU, and I will say it's great to be back. Not 3 years since I've been to Laredo. I was actually with Jerry here in Laredo, I think probably about 2 years ago. We did a tour of different border cities regarding some of the findings we had done on some reporting on the benefits of reduced wait times at the border and what that means insofar as greater commercial efficiency. So we got in Jerry's plane and went to a number of different cities, including Laredo. But I'll say Laredo for me it's such a wonderful community, and when Amy Palacios, who I think is in the room here toward the back, when she reaches out and invites me to come, it's hard for me to say no to Amy and to TAMU. It's a wonderful community. TAMU is a fantastic university, and I really fondly recall all the opportunities that I have to come here and speak, to speak with the faculty, to talk with the students, and so great to see so many students here in the audience, and as well as meet with members of the community. I've actually been doing a little bit of a test since I arrived in Laredo today. I'm a country music fan, and one of the my new favorite country music songs is actually called "Somewhere Over Laredo," not surprisingly, not a lot of people actually had heard of the song yet. But one of the things that the singer says is Laredo isn't just a place; it is a feeling. In her interview about the song, so I will say that that's the same for me when I come here. I had this feeling of really feeling welcomed by the community here in Laredo. So appreciate that. So I'm here from Washington. And actually, when people say I'm here from Washington and I have the answers, my advice to you is probably just run for the door. But rather than saying I'm here with the answers, I'm here from Washington, and I'm going to share some insight and some ideas to hopefully help to shape your thinking. First, to color my remarks, it's important to know that my comments are shaped by the fiercely nonpartisan core of the Atlantic Council, where I run the organization's Adrienne, Arsht Latin America Center. The Atlantic Council is a global institution, about 300 or so full-time employees, double that the number of non-resident fellows. We have staff all around the world. We cover every region, major thematic areas. But what is absolutely core to our agenda is being nonpartisan, and that's so needed, I think, in Washington these days, really to kind of look at all different sides of the issue. And see what works best. My role takes me really across Latin America and the Caribbean. In the past year, I've probably been to, I don't know, maybe 10 different countries across the region, doing private roundtables with heads of state or ministers, or talking with CEOs, or doing public events and other things. I saw just Jerry in Mexico a few weeks ago. And although, as I mentioned, we're headquartered in Washington, as an organization, we don't have a political agenda. Our agenda is really about working to find solutions to some of our most complex challenges, and to do so by working with the public sector, the private sector, and with academia, whether it's here in the United States or whether it's in countries all across the region. So there's a lot going on in Latin America and the Caribbean. George was giving my introduction. I've spent my entire career dedicated, focused on the importance of Latin America. And I've been saying throughout my entire career, I wish there was more attention placed on Latin America and the Caribbean. So I finally have my opportunity now. I finally have attention focused on the region. And I can no longer lament that there is that lack of attention. So what I'm going to do over the next 40 minutes is I'm going to tackle how the U.S. relationship with the region is changing. The underlying basis of longstanding ties may no longer be what drives the policy decisions today, whether it's in the U.S. or across the region. And it might no longer drive those decisions, whether it's today or in the years to come. I think we're at the precipice of seeing this change. So based on that, what could then be expected as a basis for the relationship? And how might countries then adapt to the new dynamics, the new priorities coming from the United States? So to answer these questions, I'm going to go take you through 5 points today. First, we're going to talk about how the region is rapidly changing, and how its global ties are also changing. And then here, China's rise cannot be understated. Second, I'll talk you through how the U.S. relationship with how the not only the region's changing, but the relationship of the U.S. with the region is rapidly changing. Third is looking a little bit at can we start to think, although it's still very early in the presidency, but can we start to think about a new doctrine for U.S. engagement with the hemisphere? And then fourth, how might countries adopt to the new posture with the hemisphere? What does that mean for long-term positioning? And finally, I'll focus on two specific countries of interest right now. Of course, Mexico is right here, so right across the border. So we'll talk a little bit about Mexico and what I see insofar as the role of Mexico and U.S. strategy moving forward. But also, every time you pick up a paper, actually, I don't know how many people pick up papers anymore. I still get the paper delivered. But every time you search your news, whether it's on YouTube or a WhatsApp channel or looking at different papers, you're seeing Venezuela in the news pretty much every single day. And so I'll also talk a little bit about Venezuela. First, why Latin America and the Caribbean? I think, historically there has been so much attention to global hotspots, and we see at this moment, I think it contextualize this because I'm a vice president at a global institution as well. We see so much instability around the world at this moment of profound transformations, and frankly, we're around the world, not just in one specific country. Around the world, the status quo is being upended. We say that we could be just like after World War II, we were at the beginning of a new era. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, we were at the beginning of another era. I think we are currently living through history. The history books will be written about 2025, insofar as our 2024 and 2026 being at the dawn of the next era in the world. And what does that era look like? I think it's and the question is, with all that happening, why should we be paying attention to this region that's largely peaceful? As we're looking at what this era looks like, I will say that I see this as an era of increased global fragmentation, right? I mean, I think that the multipolar world that we've seen over the last few decades is rapidly changing. We don't exactly know what's going to replace it, but we do know that something different will be replacing that, and that has to do with a whole host of different challenges globally, whether it's conflict, whether it's artificial intelligence and how that's going to fundamentally change workforces around the world. And so all of this then means looking at the importance of Latin America. And I'll say here that the Trump administration has had more of a laser focus on Latin America than I think any administration in my adult life. I've never seen, I don't think anybody I see heads nodding yes across the audience. I've never seen this level of attention to the region. And I think perhaps the last time that the region as a whole was so front and center to the White House, but probably not even to this scale, although I was younger at the time, was potentially during the Reagan administration, where Central America and specifically El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, stopping the communist threat in Central America was a focal point for the White House. But I think I would say probably looking around the room, probably 2/3 of the people in this room don't know that era, right? But that is probably the last time, and I'm not even sure if even at that time we saw as much attention as we're seeing right now. I think the administration sees stability in Latin America and the Caribbean as perhaps more important for U.S. national interests than stability in many of the other parts of the world that traditionally had captured U.S. interest. Not saying the other parts of the world are not important, but just the relative importance of stability in this hemisphere has escalated exponentially since the beginning of the year. And I'll say that the region is no less stable than it was during the first Trump administration. But what has changed is how the administration views some of the longstanding threats to U.S. interests that have long been a challenge across the region. And here I'm talking about things that have really dominated the agenda: illegal armed groups, drug trafficking, FTOs, migration. So is that the future, and what can we expect? And the incident I'm going to share with you, it doesn't come from just being an observer of the region. I did admit that I still get the paper delivered. But really, it comes from my work every day, interacting with ambassadors from across the region, with foreign government officials, meetings with offices on the Senate side and on the House side in Washington, engaging with officials and the U.S. government. And I think also as more and more U.S. ambassadors, political ambassadors get confirmed, working with them too, and also from regularly hosting ministers, heads of state, and from working with companies across sectors. So first I'll say the region is changing rapidly, and how is the region changing? I see it every day in my interactions with government officials and the private sector, and here are 4 ways that the region is changing. Political realignment, economic transformation, security policies, and also say shifting global alignments. What you see on the screen here as well is beginning with political realignment. So we see in one regard over the last couple years in certain countries swings from the left to the right. So there's a picture of President Lula swung from the right with Bolsonaro to Lula. As you could probably know, that picture was a recent picture since Lula and Trump only met this past weekend in Malaysia. I think a week ago you wouldn't have found that picture anywhere online, but there's a swing from the right to the left in Brazil, and even Uruguay. That's the new president, Yamundo Orsi, who won election in 2025. Uruguay's a little bit different because Uruguay doesn't really swing like other countries so dramatically from one side to the other. It goes kind of center right, center left, but it's always kind of center in the middle. But you see this shift from right to left, but you also see this shift from left to right, and I couldn't lose the moment to promote the Atlantic Council. So there you see President Milei of Argentina with Secretary Bessent. We presented President Milei with our Global Citizen Award in New York City during the UN General Assembly last month in September. And we invited Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, to introduce him. And it came at a very important time for Argentina, which we can go into later. But you see a dramatic swing in Argentina from the left to the right. 2 other people pictured up there is the president of Ecuador, Daniel Noboa, who Ecuador had been had been very far on the left and had been moving toward the right. And then you see Noboa's surprise election in 2023. And then just recently, just the last couple of weeks, and Bolivia, which is a country that many people don't probably spend much attention thinking about. But that is the president-elect of Bolivia, Rodrigo Paz, who will take office in about a week's time. This is important. Bolivia is a small, landlocked country, of course, but has immense natural resources, immense critical mineral resources that are absolutely vital for supply chain security and integrity. And Bolivia has been ruled for almost the last 20 years by the MAS party that is very far left. And the U.S. actually hasn't even had diplomatic relations with Bolivia in over 15 years. And that will be reset. So you have these swings in political realignment across the region. And then you also have economic transformation as well. Latin America's inflation rate remains significantly higher than that of advanced economies. That reflects ongoing challenges and price stability. The region's unemployment rate remains above the global average, and there's consistent labor market challenges that we see across the region. The region's poverty rate is lower than the global extreme rate, but it still represents significant socioeconomic challenges. Informality, a huge challenge all across the region, right here over the border in Mexico, but really across the region writ large. Still, at the same time, we see FDI inflows that have been continuing to rise, over 7% increase in 2024. Brazil and Mexico receiving the largest shares. New flows have stagnated a little bit, but these raise concerns about long-term economic competitiveness. But there is that continued kind of direct investment that's coming in. And trade relations, the U.S. remains a significant trading partner. Total trade reaching over $900 billion as of 2 years ago. But as I'll talk about in a moment, China has also significantly increased its presence, specifically focusing on sectors like energy and mining. Then there's natural resources. When you look at the economies across the region, countries like Guyana or Argentina have seen significant increased investments in their natural resources. FDI in these sectors growing by over 40% in both countries. So there is a lot of really important economic transformation that is happening across the region that is of great interest to the United States, and also is an economic transformation where the U.S. has not been as much at the table as many would like the U.S. to be. And this is, I think, this is something as well that's being looked at in Washington as part of the administration's policies, and as we're looking at some work we've been doing at the Atlantic Council on reform, reauthorization, what's called the Development Finance Corporation. What's also, when we look across the region, security policies, right? And so you've seen this state of exceptions in certain countries, the appeal of mano dura beginning with Bukele in El Salvador. New president in Peru just took office a couple of weeks ago. After the last one was ousted, I believe the 8th president in Peru in the last 10 years. So if you want job stability, that's not a good position to go for job stability. One of the first things he did was state of exception, mano dura. And we have a big election that's coming up in Chile next month. Security as well, front and center as part of the campaign. What we're also seeing is global ties that are changing. And here, China's rise really cannot be understated. And I think this map is so emblematic of the ties, of the way that China has changed across the region and China's relationship. What am I showing there? I'm showing China. I'm showing which countries have the U.S. or China as their largest trading partner. Look back in 2000. Entire hemisphere, it was all blue, all the United States. Now look, that's 2023. In pretty much both of South America, you even see another red there in Central America, has China as its largest trading partner. I mean, that's a profound transformation in just a span of 20 years. Bilateral trade grew more than 25 times over the course of the last 20 or so years. And China is now, as I mentioned, as you see up here, the largest trading partner of major economies across the region, whether it's Brazil, whether it's Chile, whether it's Peru, Uruguay, second largest for many other countries, including Colombia. There's also, China has made incredible inroads in the region when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think everyone's familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah, I see. Okay, so which initially really targeted the Indo-Pacific region, and it's now expanded to more than 130 countries. It amounts to 40% of global GDP and more than 63% of the world's population as part of Belt and Road. And in 2017, 4 years after the program was announced, China announced that Latin America would be a natural extension of the BRI, and that it would facilitate a community of shared future for China and Latin America. Panama actually became the first Latin American country to join, and now you have over 20 members across the region that are part of this Chinese investment and financing scheme that really seeks to get countries further locked in with China. The most recent country to join, given the challenges in the bilateral relationship right now, is Colombia, which has always been a historic stalwart ally of the United States. And it's not just the trade ties. I'll talk about this in a moment, but there's also really much deeper military ties with China and with militaries across the region, and other ties that I'll talk about. And I think that one of the dynamics that we're seeing is really this us versus them approach, right? And there is a desire, especially with global geopolitical competition between the U.S. and China, is wanting countries to choose. You're going to be with China or you're going to be with the United States. And countries across Latin America are not going to they're gonna try to avoid choosing and try just to kind of reap the best deals that they can from each country specifically. But as I'll mention further along, there is a growing apprehension as well to being too closely interlinked with China. So to what extent is the U.S. relationship with Latin America changing? So for much of the I'll explain these pictures in a moment, but for much of the 20th century, our ties were, and I mentioned this earlier when we talked about the 80s, our ties were on countering communism across the region, right? We see that everywhere from, and I teach on Latin American history. I can go take you all the way back to Guatemala in the 1950s, but I won't bore you with all that. But most of the 20th century really about kind of countering this communist threat, especially kind of post World War II. And then it was making peace, and we had the peace deals we saw in Central America coming about after the end of the civil wars there, and then a lot of the relationship shifting to trade, to economics, to building democracies, nascent democracies in a lot of countries. Human rights protection figured into the agenda at one point more prominently. Migration followed as a top issue. I'll say, now, as we all know, now the region, the priority in the region is really transnational criminal organizations, illicit drugs, namely fentanyl, and I'll say also, as I mentioned, China to a degree. I think China will increasingly play into U.S. priorities. I think we've seen a little bit of less of that in the first months of the new administration, but I think it will increasingly be seen more prominently out there. And another priority, of course, for the U.S. is to ensure that countries will take back migrants. There are two different approaches. I think on the issue of drugs, the U.S. is clear that countries must do more to stop the flow. And on migration, the focus is more on Mexico stopping the flow, while other countries are being asked to accept migrants, with less of an emphasis on stopping intra-regional migration. There's two different tactics. One is, the drugs stop it from coming here, and on migration, help us to accept the migrants that are in this country without legal status to come back. And there's, as I mentioned, a lot of interest in Washington on how to slow China's growing economic interests. Less a focus on democracy in the region. There was notably a July 2025 cable from the State Department that came under Secretary Rubio's direction that instructs diplomats to avoid commenting on the fairness or integrity of most foreign elections. So it's a shift of a more kind of the practical kind of day-to-day interests directly impacting the United States, and less of a focus on some of the other areas in which the U.S. has been traditionally more involved. And we also have countries that there are clear favorites in the region of the U.S. and clear countries where the relationship is a lot more rocky. We've seen that in the first months of the administration. I think that's going to continue to change. And as I showed the picture with Lula and the president there, I mean, they had a very challenging relationship the first few months of the administration. Very great a warm embrace at the UN General Assembly, a great meeting in Malaysia. So I think we're still waiting to see exactly how certain things will pan out. But what I have up on there as well is when we look at the basis for the relationship, I have the map with the pin on Panama is so important, because if you recall back in almost a year ago, probably about beginning of like December of last year, the president's focus was really on Panama, right? It was when and there's been so many other areas of priority since then, but it was really on the canal. And he was, even before the inauguration, it was a focus on the canal. The first few months of the administration, it was about essentially how do we take back the canal. I think some people were saying, oh, well, does that mean a U.S. invasion? I always said, no, we're not going to invade Panama. But I think what the president does mean is he wants more U.S. investment in Panama. He wants to take it back with U.S. interests, with more in the maritime space, telecommunications, technology. Frankly, all things in all of my conversations with the Panamanians that they all want too. I mean, there's a real kind of natural alignment with this yearning for more U.S. investment. But Panama was kind of the beginning of that, and then also globally, but on Liberation Day as well on April 2nd, focus on tariffs as part of the policy with the region, and then there's a picture there of confiscated money from organized criminal transnational criminal organizations that remains kind of a key pillar of the focus. And so the question is, how might significant shifts redefine our longstanding ties, in commerce, our longstanding ties in security and in geopolitics? I think we can take all those issues separately. I think within commerce, I would also say it's kind of a wait and see too. I mean, I think Dr. Clark and I were talking about this over lunch as well. That there's the president is a negotiator, right? He's a businessman who wants to negotiate. So he came in with these high tariff rates, and he's now working with countries around the world to find agreements. And as I mentioned just last weekend, I mean, we have a 50% tariffs on Brazil right now because of the Bolsonaro conviction. But just last weekend, he had an opportunity to sit down with President Lula and said, "I think we're going to work something out." So we're seeing, I think we're still kind of waiting to see how the commercial relationships will eventually evolve, and we see that with other countries as well. But security will remain a priority across the region and a top priority for the administration, and also the focus on geopolitics and kind of the how other countries, notably China, are kind of the extent of their ties and their influence across the region, which is seen as a threat, right, to U.S. national security interests. So, what might be the new basis for U.S. engagement with the hemisphere, and might there actually be a new doctrine for U.S. engagement with the hemisphere? I have up here a couple pictures, and the reason I have these up here is because I think one thing, as I mentioned, the level of engagement that we see across the region. Does anybody know how many countries Secretary Rubio has visited just since January of this year? Any guess? Well, sorry, in Latin America. Sorry, Jerry. Yeah, in Latin America. How many countries across Latin America? Yeah, 10. Yeah, 10 countries across Latin America. Secretary Nome has visited the same. She's visited 10 countries. Secretary Bessent has visited 1. Secretary Hegseth 1. Secretary Kenny 1. And so we see this impressive number of cabinet level officials that have been visiting the region. That's why I have their pictures up there since the beginning of the year. There's the picture with Secretary Bessent and Malay is with the notable chainsaw, which Malay has stopped using as of recently. But of course, Secretary Bessent is there with Mr. Caputo, the RFK Jr. Secretary Kenny with Malay with the chainsaw. But then Secretary Hegseth there at the Panama Canal, Secretary Rubio meeting with the Guatemalan president, and Secretary Nome with President Sheinbaum. And it just shows the level of engagement. And then when you look at, well, what is the new basis, and what is the U.S. going to really prioritize? Well, I think one way to do that is just to look at the countries that have been visited, right? Looking across the region, Argentina has been visited 3 times already by different U.S. cabinet level officials. Notably, the Secretary Rubio has not visited Argentina, but others have. And Panama, the top 2 countries that have been visited by the most cabinet officials are Argentina and Panama. 3 visits to Argentina and 3 to Panama. And that's not surprising, right? Because the president came into office very concerned about Panama, very concerned about the canal. That concern has not elevated itself in the front pages recently, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does kind of come back. It does kind of elevate at some point, and then of course, the very strong relationship with President Milei of Argentina. Mexico has had two visits, like many other countries, like Ecuador, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Guatemala. So some say, what are we seeing the emergence of? And there's been some talk of, are we seeing the emergence of something of rather than the Monroe Doctrine, are we seeing the emergence of the Donroe Doctrine? And remember, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, what that did was to warn European powers not to interfere in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, and that kind of was a kind of a strict warning that this was kind of our sphere of influence. I don't see that as President Trump's policy. I don't see his policy as telling European powers not to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. I see it could potentially be perhaps more of an offshoot, which gets a little bit less attention than the Monroe Doctrine, which is the Roosevelt Corollary, which was a 1904 addition to the Monroe Doctrine, right? And the Roosevelt Corollary said that the United States has a right to intervene in Latin American countries to ensure political and economic stability, essentially acting as a policeman for the Western Hemisphere. So Monroe Doctrine said stay out. Roosevelt Corollary says, actually, yeah, you stay out, as the Monroe Doctrine said, but we can intervene when we see it as necessary for stability. That at the time, back in 1904, that was prompted by concerns that European powers would use the inability of Latin American countries, some countries, their inability to pay debts as a justification for then their intervention in the hemisphere. And that ended up leading to, that kind of set the basis for numerous U.S. military and economic interventions that we then saw over the course of the 20th century, whether that was Nicaragua, whether it was Dominican Republic or other countries across the hemisphere. So I guess the question is, are we perhaps seeing the emergence of the America First corollary to that original doctrine, one where the United States sees that it has the right to intervene, whether it's directly or indirectly intervening, if national developments are seen as threatening U.S. national interests, be it security developments, be it foreign terrorist organizations, be it economic security interests, or other such issues that are deemed as essential. I don't have the answer to that. I'm just putting out the question as, are we starting to see perhaps the emergence of that? I'll also say that it's certainly a doctrine or corollary that favors bilateral engagement. This administration strongly prefers bilateral engagement over multinational efforts, right? That there's more of an opportunity, especially from a getting things done perspective. It's easier to get things done on a bilateral basis than it is on a multilateral basis, for the whole host of reasons that anybody who's been a part of any multilateral discussions knows. The complexity and getting the X number of countries to agree on one paragraph or one sentence or even one word in a sentence. And I'll also say, most importantly, we also see that this focus on the hemisphere is reflected in the Department of War's focus on the Western Hemisphere. This is evidenced most explicitly in Venezuela, which I will get to later. So the question is then, how might countries adapt to this new U.S. posture? And again, we're only in the early stages of a new administration, so we're still waiting to see exactly what will be the final kind of policies, the final doctrine. In 3 years later, of what the administration has achieved in the Americas. But the question is, how might countries begin to adopt to this? And I have this interesting picture, because it's uncertainty ahead. You have like the lightning, which says warning. The sun, it looks like a sun. Everything looks beautiful. Everything looks great. or like the thunderstorm of like in the cloud of like, well, things are shaky, but they could go in the right direction, they could not. So how are countries seeking, what path are they seeking to choose? And I think there's three different things that we're seeing. There's certain countries that are seeing this moment of a lot of change in U.S. positioning with the hemisphere to either double down on their relationship with the United States, to diversify, try to diversify a little bit away from the United States, or to find this like cautious middle ground of we're gonna continue our kind of the status quo, but we're gonna have to adapt in certain ways. I think the best example of a country that's doubled down is, again, Argentina. I mean, when I look at probably even around the world, I don't see another country anywhere else in the world, not just talking about Latin America, anywhere else in the world where the administration has had such a warm, benevolent relationship, right? Where frankly the ability of the Argentine president to secure over 40% of the votes in the legislative election this past Sunday, I would say, was in no small part due to the support, the incredibly strong support, and I think the warranted support that he's received from the United States for his economic policy. So you have countries like Argentina that have doubled down as we're looking at this new posture. I think there's other countries as well. El Salvador has doubled down in its relationship, and there are others that have as well. Ecuador, very strong relationship. Paraguay, very strong relationship. And then there's I think there's countries that are looking at diversifying, right? Saying, gosh, I'm not sure if this is the right course. The U.S. has historically been our longstanding ally, but also it's on both sides. It's on the U.S. side and on that country's. I'm referring here to Colombia. Colombia has been one of our most important historic allies, but it's not actually. I actually just wrote an article on this last week. It didn't just begin this year with the new U.S. administration. It actually began when the new president of Colombia assumed office. 1 month after assuming office, he went to the UN and decried the longstanding basis of the U.S. relationship. He had a lot of challenging meetings on Capitol Hill. He had a challenging relationship with the Biden administration, even more challenging relationship with the Trump administration. He's now been sanctioned as of last Friday. His visa was revoked a few weeks ago after he was protesting in the streets of New York. So we have certain countries that have really sought to diversify, or the leaders have. Thankfully, there's an election there next year. And then you have countries that try to find this like cautious middle ground of we got to work together, but also I know I need to kind of continue to diversify because I don't want to have these strong ties always. I put kind of Mexico in that category. I think the President Sheinbaum has done a really great job in finding common ground on issues that are of importance to this administration, and frankly many that are important to her in Mexico. But also we see even beginning early in the year, a strengthening of the trade agreement with Europe that Mexico has done. There's talks now of a trading relation, of a commercial agreement with Brazil, and so you see this natural propensity to diversify. I would put the Mercosur countries, the Brazil, even Argentina is part of that. Uruguay and Paraguay is part of that. It's been over 25 years. They've been trying to strike a trade agreement with the Europeans. There's now news that they're hopefully trying to strike that agreement by the end of this year. They tried again 2 years. They tried 2 years ago last time. It didn't work out. So we'll see what happens. But you have this kind of cautious middle ground. Brazil was probably part of that too, right? I mean, Lula and Trump had a great meeting a week ago, but Brazil is also expanding its trade relations with Southeast Asian countries like India, Indonesia, Malaysia, viewing the region as a hub of global growth and innovation. I'll also say that China is using the changes in U.S. policy to its advantage. And I said before I was going to come back to China, and I am. I think in early May, there was an opening ceremony of the China CELAC Forum. CELAC is the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations. And in that meeting, President Xi unveiled a 5-year plan that will guide China's engagements with the 33 countries that include CELAC. And that plan is based on solidarity, 5 different points: solidarity, development, civilization, peace, and people-to-people connectivity. And I think what gets a lot of attention is that graph I put up before, the graph of trade relations, the talk of the BRI, the concerns, I think the president's rightful concerns about the Chinese ports at either end of the Panama Canal that he first raised. Well, he raised it in December, but he's actually been raising that since the 1980s. But he raised it more forcefully then. But I think the solidarity pillar is really focused on this plan of cementing political ties across ideological lines. And I think one of the most telling pillars of that is China's pledge to invite 300 political party officials from CELAC countries to Beijing annually. So that means 900 officials over 3 years. And this is the reason they're doing this is not simply an effort about diplomacy. It's also about how do you kind of hedge against electoral volatility. China's recognized, what I showed before, is these swings from left to right. And so what China's doing is they're inviting political leaders from all different parties, all different ranks. So whoever comes to the presidency, no matter what happens, there is some kind of stronger tie with China. They're also offering international Chinese teaching scholarships. They've even, as part of the civilization pillar, they have pledged to send 30,000 Chinese textbooks to CELAC member states to spread China-friendly narratives in Latin America in educational and cultural spaces. This is all part of their 5-year plan that was announced recently. Plans to provide training opportunities, 500 training opportunities for scholars and journalists from CELAC countries, sponsoring Chinese film and television exhibitions, translating new TV series from Mandarin into Spanish and into Portuguese. And so this is all a kind of part of the full court press that we're seeing from China across the region. And again, it's not just economics and commercial. 10 years ago, I would go travel to the region, and I would see how the lack of kind of understanding of Chinese diplomats of the region. Or I go meet with Chinese officials when they're who represent China in the OAS, and I'd see them, and their English skills were poor, their Spanish skills weren't great either. And now when you go to the region, China is sending some of its best diplomats to Latin America. Panama is actually one of the places where they've historically been sending some of their best diplomats. And they're playing the full game. They're playing the soft power, the economics, the commercial. They're playing the mill to mill, as the military to military as well. What should countries do? I think one is not get in the middle of these geopolitics. Look out for self-interest. But I think it's also important to recognize that the U.S. is ultimately here to stay, right? And I think despite all these efforts that China is doing, there's more values, there's more cultural affinity, there's more people-to-people ties, hence the importance of kind of strong institutions like TAMU and other educational institutions that welcome students, that welcome professors from across the region. That builds those ties that China is never going to be able to replicate despite its best intentions. So finally, I'm going to speak on 2 specific countries of interest right now, Venezuela, and since we're just across the border, I'm going to talk about Mexico. So I could probably spend the next hour talking about Venezuela. I'm going to try and do it quickly. This map is as of October 16th, and it's a New York Times analysis of U.S. Assets deployed in the Caribbean. And again, that was 13 days ago. But you see the significant U.S. Military buildup, stealth fighters, replenishment ships, amphibious readiness group, guided missile destroyers, combat ships, special force ships. This doesn't take into account the USS Gerald Ford, where it was announced last Friday that carrier strike group was making its way to the Caribbean. This is the most advanced of our carrier strike groups that is now on its way to the Caribbean. The question goes, well, how did this start? Is this kind of out of thin air? We just decided to send all these assets to the Caribbean. I mean, the history is long. The history goes back to Hugo Chavez taking power over 25 years ago, Nicolas Maduro almost 15 years ago, not quite. But it also goes back to the fact that one of the things that we've seen in the first months of the administration is it's clear that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is in charge of Latin American policy, right? And not only is he Secretary of State, he's a national security advisor. He's got a number of other titles. I can't recall ever seeing a Secretary of State who knows Latin America and is as passionate about Latin America, obviously speaks fluent Spanish, as our current Secretary of State. Not just him, but even our Deputy Secretary of State, somebody who I've had the opportunity to work with a lot over the years, including when he did a brilliant job serving as ambassador to Mexico in the first Trump administration, Chris Landau. Chris Landau also understands Latin America very well. His father served across the region as a diplomat. Chris lived across the region, again, speaks fluent Spanish. But with Marco Rubio in charge, you have to look at Secretary Rubio's historical linkage in his where his family, the Cuban roots of his family, and his deep concern and I think visceral hatred of dictatorships, of autocratic regimes, because that was his family bore the brunt of that when it comes to Cuba. And I think Secretary Rubio has been for quite some time. You even look at that legislation that he sponsored in the Senate, fixated on how to bring about a democratic change to Venezuela. This is not new for him, and so Secretary Rubio is now in charge. I mean, you look at the President Trump with his press conference with President Malay 2 weeks ago. There was another question about Latin America, and he said, talk to Marco. He's my best source on all things Latin America. So he clearly defers to Secretary Rubio, and the secretary, I think, sees this moment as an opportunity. The question is an opportunity for what, right? And I think that there is a very strong desire across the administration to see Nicolas Maduro out of power. We raised the bounty on him to $50 million just a couple months ago. But President Trump is also not new to Venezuela. This is not just an issue of the second term. Back in his first term, he actually led by the National Security Advisor at the time, John Bolton. He had a significant, he really doubled down on supporting the Venezuelan opposition. At that time, it was the interim government that was led by Juan Guaido, and nearly 60 countries around the world getting them to recognize Guaido. They had a huge humanitarian convoy amassed on the Colombian border that was going to bring about defections and an insurrection in Venezuela. That didn't happen. So this is not new to President Trump, but there's a natural convergence of a couple issues. One, as I mentioned before, his priority on security and stopping the drug trade in the United States and stopping fentanyl from coming into the United States. So that's, of course, the justification as it's been shared publicly for the military buildup in the Caribbean. Of course, Venezuela is not a major drug producing country. It's actually a transit country for many drugs, but you see a lot drug producing coming from Peru and Colombia, and this is why you've started to see some attacks on ships in the Pacific as well, because a lot of those drugs come through the Pacific. But I think for many as well, it's also and the president has been explicit on announcing publicly what's always been private, which always been the longstanding kind of covert CIA operations in Venezuela. The president now has decided to put them out there and say that they're public, again, meant to kind of scare the pants off of Maduro, right? Meant to say that watch it, because your time is coming. And I think also the U.S. military buildup is meant to show Maduro's weakness. So with the idea that perhaps his own military might rise up as well. Now that there are some challenge. There are kind of insurrections in the Venezuelan military that have been put down beforehand because of the infiltration of Cuban spy agents. But I think there's a hope that where do we go next? And there's a couple different options, right? One option is the U.S. states targeting drug boats that are coming through the Caribbean. Another option is the U.S. starts with land strikes on drug-producing facilities or facilities seen as transporting drugs in Venezuela. And then I think there's a third option that's talked about, which is a full-scale invasion. I don't really see that as possible. We just don't have the troop buildup in the Caribbean, especially at this point. I think estimates are there's about 10,000 or so troops. You need many more troops than that to actually have some kind of full-scale invasion. But I think what also is different this time around is that you actually have a year ago, you have the Venezuelan people who actually did elect a different president, right? All the voting tallies that have been put out there showed that Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado, who just won the Nobel Peace Prize, that he was elected president. So this is I think this is kind of a wait and see. I will say that the commander of U.S. Southern Command resigned recently. His resignation goes into effect in December. We're still in the middle of hurricane season, as we know, and my thoughts go with all of our Jamaican friends after the storm that hit Jamaica yesterday. So I don't see any kind of further buildup until probably after hurricane season, maybe when there's when those conditions or kind of further action or significant action until the waters are calmer, kind of post storm. But I think I see this as also a sign to other countries in the hemisphere of the seriousness with which the U.S. is now focused on tackling the security situation, and the fact that we're willing to deploy kind of the full assets of some of our top assets in the military to be able to accomplish that. So I can take a lot more questions on Venezuela. Again, I can speak for an hour on probably Venezuela and policy options and what's happening and whatnot. But I do want to, noting that 7 o'clock, I do want to end by also focusing on Mexico. I think we got some great news. I think just yesterday with the continuation of the pause in any additional tariffs. The president said yesterday, I like the extension with Mexico when he was I think it was on Air Force One. And I think with Mexico, what we're seeing, and Jared and I were just in Mexico together a few weeks ago, is I do believe that the Mexican government is really playing its cards right. I think one of the things that Mexico is doing different from probably many other countries is there are delegations of Mexican officials in Washington pretty much every single week. And a lot of that's not making the news, but there are secretaries, there are undersecretaries who are constantly engaging with U.S. counterparts and constantly trying to find a way to find a solution that serves U.S. interests and that serve Mexican interests, right? Because Mexico as well their interest is not to have drugs coming through Mexico or to have illegal migrants coming through Central America through Mexico. It's destabilizing for them as well. But there's a different focus on has traditionally been a different focus on how to approach it. But there's a general willingness to try to find that solution and really to kind of work hard on that. There was that November 1st deadline to potentially increase the fentanyl-related tariffs that would be imposed on certain Mexican goods, but that has now been delayed. And so, what I see is this real potential to be able to work out a security, a migration deal, because that is also absolutely fundamental for the USMCA negotiations. And as we're entering this critical review period of an agreement that matters so much for, I think, most of us here in this room, this is agreement, of course, that it was inked in the first administration, that agreement is about the trade barriers. That there will be discussions about some of the non-tariff barriers, but the agreement is also, just as we've seen in the first months of this administration, that trading relationships and tariffs and trade agreements are not just about trade, right? They're about other objectives and how to use trade and trading agreements to achieve those other objectives. Whether that's the 50% on Brazil for the conviction of President Bolsonaro, or whether that's the continued pause, but still the threats of additional tariffs on Mexico for security or for lack of compliance on security and migration, and so there is my conversations as well with not only with folks on the U.S. side, but also on the Mexican side too, is there is a lot of optimism that we're going to be able to use this moment to be able to even further strengthen the U.S.-Mexico relationship. But it's not easy, not only because of some of the concerns on security and migration, but because of also the long-standing concerns on trade agreements. Whenever there is a trade agreement that's up for discussion, it's always the people who are anti the agreement that usually have a much louder voice than the people who are in favor of an agreement, right? We've seen that historically. This is one of the reasons that there's a comment period for USMCA. We'll be submitting some comments from the Atlantic Council on the importance of the agreement, and so I think that it's also about not just kind of the congressmen and senators that understand and are here frequently and understand the importance of Mexico, but also talking to all the other members, because pretty much every single state in this country has Mexico as one of their top three trading partners, and I think getting that message out there is absolutely critical. So I think I've spoken for almost an hour, and so hopefully I've kept you relatively entertained. I don't see too many people that have been nodding off over the course of the last hour, so hopefully that means I've been successful. What I will say is that as I said in the beginning, there's never been this much attention to the Americas. Every single day there is something. I record a video on it that goes on Instagram and on X on every Monday that looks ahead to what's going to happen in the Americas this week and what happened the previous week. It's hard to keep it to a minute because every week there's 5 or 6 different things that are bubbling up. The question is this sustainable? Is this what we are going to continue to see for the next few years? And if so, is this what we're going to see in the next presidency as well? Is this a new focus of a real recognition of the fact that we kind of ignore the Western Hemisphere in our own peril, and so is this going to continue? And I think what we've seen so far is we've seen a lot of kind of changes in some of the policy and different countries that have been areas of focus at different times. Obviously with some continuity, Panama early on, now it's Colombia, Venezuela has been a through line. I raised the question, with all these military assets in the Caribbean, Cuba's right there as well. What's going to happen there? Nicaragua is when you look at kind of the countries that have concern for Secretary Rubio, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, another country ruled by a dictator. Not only that, but Nicaragua is also complacent, actually makes open overtures for countries around the world to send migrants to Managua, and then they help to kind of provide the facilities for them to try to come north to the United States. And so there's a Russian presence in Nicaragua as well. So what are we going to continue to see? We have I was moderating a conversation a couple weeks ago in Washington. We were talking about the soon to be released new national security strategy. What will that strategy look like? That's going to give a lot of indication of where the Department of War is going to be focused in the years ahead. I assume that will have a large focus on the Western Hemisphere. How big of a focus will it have? What will be the objectives that it's going to place? We know some of the objectives already, but what are going to be some of those objectives? They're going to really then set the guiding principles for the year to come. So with that, I invite you all to follow me on Instagram or follow me on X. I mentioned I do a lot of videos and and putting out a lot of publications regularly. At the Atlantic Council in Washington, we're always doing public events. They're always live streamed. We can make sure that everybody here in the audience can have access to that to gain some additional kind of firsthand insight as we're talking to policymakers about key developments that are happening across the Americas. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have microphones at the two corners. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we can start with the Q&A session. There's one here.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alejandro Chapa. I work with IBC Bank at the International Department. Thank you for being here, Mr. Marczak. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. Actually, 3 years ago, we were here at this very same room, and I asked a question about the TPP. I know a lot happened in 3 years. You already explained. One of that question was in regards to that particular that you mentioned about the canal, the Panama Canal, and then the inter-oceanic corridor that it was proposed in Mexico, land, of course, because of that canal being very short on water or the sea level, and potentially the disruption on supply chains. So what is the position on the TPP right now? Does it exist? I'm not very familiar right now after those 3 years. And another question, you mentioned about the Monroe Doctrine. Also, is there any similarity about the Marshall Plan? Can you explain a little bit more, elaborate? And one last question. I have a third one. About Venezuela. Is it? I know it's a TPP. I'm sorry. It's a part of the cartel of petroleum, of oil. The OPEP.
Yeah.
So what's the role on the U.S. interest about is it Valero or Shell company? Why don't they start there blocking that instead of doing the invasion plan?
Yeah.
Turn the wall.
Yeah. Alejandro, great questions, and actually very impressive that you remember the questions that you asked 3 years ago. I frankly don't know how you did that. I'm not even sure I can remember the questions I might have asked somebody 3 weeks ago. Certainly 3 months ago. I think so. I'll take that kind of in reverse. I think Venezuela, U.S. interests, oil companies. What we've seen is it's actually interesting. I think with regard to U.S. oil and specifically Chevron in Venezuela, what we've seen is, I think we've seen in some ways, and this is a somewhat of a continuity of policy, which is so interesting between the Biden and the Trump administrations on Chevron, right? Because, in the Biden administration, the oil licenses were revoked, but then there were special waivers granted to companies like Chevron, and then the Trump administration did something similar. And I think that I think there's two different kind of perspectives on this. So one perspective, which is why Chevron has been continued to allowed to operate in Venezuela. One perspective is better us than them, right? Is that if we don't have some kind of like U.S. foothold in Venezuela's oil, the world's largest proven oil reserves, if we don't have some kind of U.S. foothold, we're going to give even more ground to our geopolitical rivals, whether it's the Chinese or the Russians or whatnot, right? And the relationship has been set up such that the funding, the funds, as you know, Alejandro, that come out of that are meant to be such that they're not further enriching the regime, but with Chevron's presence there and with the drilling, it still is. I mean, it's providing jobs, and it does have an impact on the Venezuelan economy. And I think then the other perspective is just get them out, because even though these even though the license has been set up to be able to mitigate any positive impact, any positive benefits for Maduro, there still are going to be some positive benefits, and so we should just withdraw that license. And so I think that's been the debate, and I think this is why you've seen a consistent one of the odd points of consistency between Republican and Democrat administrations, which is this consistent desire to allow for that operation to continue. I think that when the U.S. looks at what comes next, I'm going to use this moment to riff for a moment on Venezuela. When the U.S. looks at what comes next in Venezuela, I think it's also important to point out that if, God willing, Maduro is removed from power tomorrow, whether he flees the country or whatever happens, Venezuela is, it does have a government that was elected a year ago. It does have incredible natural wealth and resources. So it does have incredible human capital. A lot of that human capital has moved away, but a lot of human capital wants to come back to help to rebuild the country eventually. And so kind of when you look at other situations around the world where there's been a dictator in power for years, that dictator leaves and there's just an incredible vacuum. A lot of those have been countries where there isn't as much kind of human capital and natural resources and other opportunities as there is in Venezuela. On the Marshall Plan, I think the question was kind of, is this an opportunity for a Marshall Plan for the Western Hemisphere or something along those lines? I think that what we've seen is a more of a focus of the administration, and I think we're gonna see more coming from that. We're gonna see in the first administration there's something called America Crece, which translates to America Builds, and what's been worked on now is a second version of America Crece. And so we expect to see that come out in the next few months, and that's going to be kind of I think in Spanish because I said America Crece, but that'll be the updated version of that. That's really about kind of less kind of the benevolent rebuilding, but more of like, how do we really structure U.S. investment into the region? How do we help to give the financing tools that the U.S. government can provide, and also some of the backing that the U.S. government can provide, so that U.S. companies really can start to make those investments that frankly we're not doing right now. We're not investing in the major port. One of the concerns about the ports in Panama, or take ports in the Chancay port in Peru, or the ports in Chile, U.S. companies we're not building these ports right now. We're not, and there isn't that incentive. We're not able to win the tenders. The regulations do not favor U.S. companies. So countries are looking at that, but I think there's going to be a broader incentive. And also, as we've been doing a lot of work on the reauthorization of the Development Finance Corporation, which from my perspective should move from a development institution to an institution that's helping to better position the United States to effectively compete with China in the hemisphere. So that might be kind of our version of a Marshall Plan, is like this America Build 2.0, a new development finance corporation that's less focused on countries' income when it comes to financing projects, but more focused on strategic projects and strategic sectors that are important for U.S. interests, and thereby also sectors, telecommunications, technology, natural resources, things that we all know are fundamental for our economic security. Now, the TPP, yes, we moved on from TPP. That was a conversation a few years ago. I think that there's probably I think if we were a signatory to TPP exists, yes, the U.S. is not a signatory to it. And I think if probably the U.S. were a signatory to it right now, we probably would be rethinking that signature at this point because of the deep interlinkage with a number of countries that are seen as kind of commercial competitors to the United States.
I have a question here from our online audience. So this is, how has the decline of US manufacturing and the rise of nearshoring affected economic ties with Latin America?
So decline of U.S. So how is decline of manufacturing? So we've done a lot of work, the Atlantic Council on nearshoring, and I'll say that nearshoring presents a huge opportunity for the region. What we've moved from the term near. I don't think nearshoring is a term that's in vogue anymore. It's a term, maybe it was last year's term. It's not this year's term, right? Because now we don't talk about nearshoring, we talk about reshoring, right? But actually, a term that we put out recently is this concept of, because we need more terms, is a concept of twin shoring. And twin shoring is how do we not shore to another country, or rather than shore directly to the United States, because we can't produce everything here, but how do we twin shore? How do we find opportunities to produce certain aspects of the supply chain in countries that have a comparative ability to be able to do so, and then also use that as an opportunity to bring more jobs to the United States as part of that broader supply chain. And I think that there is a resurgence. I think we're going to see more. This is the president's focus on more U.S. manufacturing coming back to the U.S. But we simply can't manufacture everything, right? And we don't have the population. We don't have the setup. And frankly, a lot of it's probably is not necessarily makes the most economic sense for us to be manufacturing here, especially some of the low cost production. So I think that there remains a significant opportunity to be doing things like how we jointly produce with Mexico, right? And the fact that 30 cents of every $1 that we import from Mexico is actually American produced goods. But what we need to do is we need to make sure that the things that are being produced outside of the United States are not things that we could have been producing inside the United States. And that is, I think, the president's concern. But I go back to kind of this other terms of this twin shoring term of producing parts of the supply chain jointly and bringing that manufacturing. We're not going to be able to bring all that manufacturing from all of Asia or all of China directly back to the United States. This is not economically viable. It doesn't matter how high the tariffs are. It's just not going to be profitable. So how do we do so in a way that brings the manufacturing that's going to be critical, the critical nodes in the supply chain to the countries in the hemisphere, whether that's Mexico, Dominican Republic, whether that's our Central American neighbors, that can take advantage of and have the ability to produce domestically, but do so through a more increasingly interwoven supply chain that brings jobs back to the United States at the same time.
Excellent. Are there any other questions from our audience here? We have a question there.
Hello. I know you mentioned the U.S. trying to reclaim the Panama Canal. I had read previously that BlackRock was involved in the acquisition. Do you foresee any issues with the Panama Canal being private in the future?
What's your name?
Gerardo Garcia.
What's that?
Gerardo Garcia.
Gerardo, thank you for that question. And I think that question is an excellent one as well, because it also, I think, puts on the table a number of issues that are important to clarify with the Panama Canal. So one is the Panama Canal. Gerardo, the Panama Canal is China doesn't own the Panama Canal, right? The Panama Canal is owned by it's the Panamanian government, right? That controls all the transit that goes across the canal. U.S. military ships actually get priority passage through the canal. I was just going to the canal, where was I there? In January of this year. and talking to the Panama Canal Administrator. We actually hosted, last week I was in Madrid, but we hosted the Minister of the Canal Affairs for Panama. So the canal itself is Panamanian run, and with priority access for the U.S. That's part of the treaty when we gave Panama control of the canal. Now, Gerardo, the big question you're asking is the Chinese ports on either side of the canal, on the Pacific side and on the Caribbean side, and the U.S. also does have ports, right? And these, so I think important to know that these ports were first granted to actually it was a Hong Kong-based company, Hutchinson, when Hong Kong wasn't yet a part of China, right? So this is kind of part of the history here. And then Hong Kong became part of China, and this is so these are now companies that run the port that are Chinese owned. There has also been a lot of concern in this new Panamanian government, from all my conversations, with the corruption that goes alongside the Chinese control of these ports. And not only what we see on a day-to-day, but on the original deal that Hutchinson got back in the 90s, and then on even more importantly, the extension of that deal, because the extension, they were given the same terms as they did when they first were granted the land, but years later they didn't have to actually build any facilities. They already had everything, so they still got the same kind of tax breaks and whatnot. So I think it's important to note that there are concerns on the Panamanian side. Now, yes, as part of with the focus of President Trump on the canal, again, dating back to even the 1980s when he was frustrated that he thought the U.S. really got a bad deal. He didn't understand as a businessman. Why would you give something away for nothing? Why do you give something away for free? And so he's always had these concerns about the canal. But these concerns really have come to a head, especially in the first half of the year. There was a deal, as you mentioned, with BlackRock to be able to acquire those ports. Now, but what needs to happen, which is still being delayed, and this is the big question, is Hutchinson needs Chinese government sign off, because they cannot. It's not like the United States where a company can just decide to sell whatever it wants to sell. So they haven't yet gotten that sign off from the Chinese government to be able to make that sell. Now, whether they get it or not, to be determined. I think my understanding is it might be in the next few weeks or so whether we'll know if there actually is going to be that sign off or not. And if there isn't, then what is my understanding is that there are some contingency plans that the Panamanians are thinking through. But what are those contingency plans? Because I know the Panamanians certainly want to avoid the wrath of the United States and saying, "Oh gosh, look, we're coming back. We're now refocused on you because you haven't been able to sell off those port assets." So, I think this continues to be an evolving question. But I will say that it is definitely in the Panamanians' interest to make this deal happen, not just because the president has put the pressure, President Trump has put the pressure to do so, but as well because even before President Trump raised it, the Panamanians, especially the new Panamanian government, has been concerned about the corruption around these ports. And when you look at some of the new tenders and the way that they're structuring some additional projects around the canal, they're trying to make sure they're structuring them to make sure that they're they can't not allow the Chinese to compete for those bids, but they can put in a lot of transparency clauses that makes it very difficult for a Chinese company, especially a state-owned company, even a Chinese private company, to be able to compete.
So I think we have about 5 minutes left, so we need to keep our questions short.
And I'll try to keep my answers short too.
And so I'll give you another online question. This comes from Professor James Norris, and he wants to know, your crystal ball, what do you predict or guess for Chile's presidential election? He told his class today that he expected conservatives and centrists to unite in support of Cast in the runoff election. Another example of going from one extreme to another again.
So I've not to name drop, I've actually had the opportunity to meet with CAST when I was in Chile earlier this year, and I met with Evelyn Mate. I haven't met with Hara, but I do think that it will be that we're going to see a movement to the right in Chile. I've actually even heard recently that it could actually not even make it to a runoff. It could actually make it in the we actually could have a victor in the first round in Chile. I think CAST has really changed his positioning, his posture from the last time he ran for election. When he ran last time, he was really seen as a kind of outsider candidate. He's become much more, I think, seen as kind of right mainstream. And I think that there's a very good chance that this election is decided in the first round. In Chile, and specifically, this is a country where we've historically not paid a lot of attention to. I bet most Americans probably couldn't even find Chile on a map, just like most Americans probably even couldn't find Panama on a map. Probably most Americans used to think Panama was a north-south country rather than an east-west country. It does run a little bit north-south, but it's primarily east-west country. But Chile has also become important because of the natural resources, because of the growing Chinese encroachment in Chile. And this election is really, it's a security election as well. You've seen a real growth in organized crime, concerns about migration in Chile as well. So a lot of the same concerns that we saw play out in the last U.S. election, security and migration, are some of the concerns that are playing out in that election.
Excellent. Do we have another question from the audience here? Anyone? You have a question over here. Oops, we have a question. Go.
Hi, Mr. Marczak. Thank you for coming out and speaking to us today. My name is Enrique. I had a question. You noted that we're seeing a shift of trade partners in Latin America shifting from the U.S. to China. How do you think that plays a role with the reciprocal tariffs that are in place? I think China is also one of our biggest trading partners. You mentioned earlier that we're probably not going to see a lot of domestic manufacturing here in the U.S. and China does a lot of that. That laptop, I'm pretty sure if you look on the bottom, says "Made in China." So, what is kind of the going forward steps that we can kind of see? Because this wait and see sort of stance that we have right now, I'm sure if everyone goes to HEB, we've noticed that prices have gone up. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Enrique, should I take, in the minister time, I'm happy to take both questions together.
Thank you very much. My name is Victor Estrada. I'm a grad student of public administration here at TAMIU. This is my sixth time joining TAMIU in 23 years. So I have several degrees on the back.
Fantastic.
So I have a question or an observation. There have been a lot of changes in Mexico or reforms. I can say dangerous reforms, in my opinion, about the judicial, for example, the Congress with the supermajority, and of course many reforms. Actually, the Constitution recently. And how do you see our relationships with Mexico? Because it has been changing, very, very, very dangerous. In my opinion, Mexico was the bully country in Latin America, against U.S. How do you see Mexico, their relationship right now, in the near future?
Thank you, Victor. And I'll also say, I think probably Dr. Maynard here in the second row is probably very happy to hear that you have, you said how many degrees? 6 degrees from Tammy? So, okay, so that's fantastic. And
I'm sorry, because of my German accent. I didn't take
So that's fantastic, and maybe it's a message to all the other students in the room. Come and get 6 degrees here at TAMIU, right? I'll take your question first, Enrique, and then I'll go to yours, Victor. First, I just want to clarify. It's not that I don't see manufacturing coming to the U.S. I do see manufacturing coming to the U.S. I just don't see all the manufacturing, every part of the manufacturing that China is doing being able to be absorbed by the U.S. It's just what China has been able to build. And even the degree of automation. I mean, China has factories that run 24/7. They have that run because it's robots that are able to do the work overnight. I mean, so the level of automation in China is profound, and so we're not going to be able to bring. We're already seeing some of these announcements of bringing back some more manufacturing. We just don't have the capacity to bring it all back. But I think that, how do these trade patterns shift with China, especially the reciprocal tariffs? We've already started to see this growing Chinese, and I pointed these graphs earlier, commercial relationships with the region. And they're really focused on not the way that the U.S. generally works with the region. They're really focused because whether it's a state-owned company or a private company, there still is some kind of affiliation with the Chinese government, right? And so when you look at Chinese investments in the region, commercial investments, they don't always have to be profitable investments, but they're investments that are intrinsically tied to China's national interests, right? And so you see that in natural resources. China owns the Lima's electricity grid. So if China wants to shut off the lights in Lima, they can, right? There's a real concern about Chinese investment in, like Huawei, of course, technology, telecommunications, not just because it's Huawei, but because of that sector. But it also then could impede U.S. companies from being able to invest in certain countries, because if you have to use Chinese technology, if the only option is Chinese technology for the backbone of your own operations, that then presents a liability for U.S. companies. So there's a lot of kind of additional impacts that has. I think the role, when you look at the reciprocal tariffs, most of Latin America got off as good as any other as anywhere else in the world. Most of the region got off with the baseline of 10%, except for a few countries. And actually Mexico did phenomenal because everything that comes under USMCA is exempt from some tariffs. Which, when that was announced, that was such a I think an important part of that announcement, because I think it was to be debated at that point whether USMCA compliant goods were going to be part of that tariff or not. And the fact that a USMCA compliant exemption was put forward as part of the Mexico tariffs, I think that showed from an early sign that the administration believes in the importance of USMCA. And I think just we keep that in our minds as we're entering this review period for USMCA, that carve out back in April shows that the administration does recognize the agreement's importance. But yeah, why did most of the region get 10% and not these higher? And we saw the higher numbers. Most of Latin America has a trade deficit with the United States. So we've done a lot of analysis. The Atlantic Council, as a whole, the U.S. exports more to Latin America than Latin America exports to the United States. And so that is why there's a few countries where that isn't the case. But by and large, across the region, there is a trade deficit with the United States. That's unlike anywhere else in the world. Most other countries, this is why the president's fresh, most other countries, the U.S. has a trade deficit. That is not the case in the region, which is why you saw these baseline tariffs, and why actually there is a rumbling is that we're going to have an Argentina trade deal. They're talking with others, and so I think there'll be more deals that we'll see. Victor, I know we're out of time, but Victor, I think how do I see the relationship with Mexico, the reforms? I think that one of Mexico has had kind of has had an unexpected and expected hit to its economy over the course of the last year. I think one of the things when President Sheinbaum came into office, she knew she'd have to deal with the repercussions of the judicial reform, right? The added uncertainty that brings to the business environment by having these judges and starting to then see how are those judges going to especially preside over cases that involve important commercial decisions, because businesses need that certainty in the judicial environment to be able to make deals. And then she got on top of that the uncertainty of the back and forth with the U.S. tariffs. And that's been two kind of headwinds that have hit Mexico. But I think specifically the concerns around the judicial reform are profound, right? And I think that we just saw the first slate of new judges taking office a few months ago. I think we're waiting to see when there's some major cases that are brought before those judges that impact U.S. business interests. What are those rulings going to look like? Is there that significant training? But I think kind of going back to my earlier point, how do I see the relationship with Mexico? And I've said this over the course of the presentation, that I see this moment, and maybe I'm always a glass half full person than a glass half empty, but I see this moment as an opportunity to really kind of build the next phase of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. I've seen a real willingness on the Mexican side to do that, a willingness on the U.S. side to do that. Again, I mean, it's been multiple times that the president, again, just this week, President Trump announced yet another delay in the implementation of any tariffs because he sees that good faith effort from the Mexican side. His administration sees that as well. I think from a binational perspective, I see an opportunity. We're doing more work at the Atlantic Council on how do we work on a binational perspective to ensure what we all want: economic security, greater competitiveness. Now, I think unfortunately we don't see that across North America. I think the U.S.-Canada relationship is very different from the U.S.-Mexico relationship. But there's also been, I think, a different willingness from Mexican officials, and there's been an ability to kind of get to where that compromise needs to happen to serve kind of our mutual interests. So I know we're out of time. I just want to end again by thanking all of you for your undivided attention. I hope Dr. Maynard that you're being here for your inaugural keynote speakers presentation. That this has hopefully enticed you to come back for others, and great to have all the questions from the students and faculty and community members. And I want to just end by thanking IBC Bank and Jerry and Commerce Bank and you, Dr. Clark and Amy for all the great work in putting this speaker series together. As I said from the beginning, I love coming down to Laredo. Love coming to TAMU. It's a fantastic university. And so just look forward to the next time that either you invite me down or maybe Jerry invites me or someone else invites me down here to Laredo.
Thank you very much. I have a gift to give. You may already have one of these since you've been here before. We give a globe to everyone. We want to give everyone the world. So.
Thank you very much. I do have one, but I will gladly accept the second. I will gladly accept the second one.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for coming. Before you all leave, I'd like to thank everyone who made this event possible. I'd of course like to thank IBC and Commerce Bank again for their generous support. I want to thank Amy Palacios, the Associate Director of the Center, who does all the hard work in getting the speakers down here. Finally, I'd like to thank the staff in the Western Hemispheric Trade Center and the School of Business, OIT for their excellent support for recording the event services, and the students from the Dean's Advisory Council who carry our microphones around. So once again, and I want to thank the entire audience, both online and in person, for coming, and I apologize if we didn't get to your questions.